Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. It's the first of our regular evidence sessions in this Parliament with the Rail Minister, and we're covering rail services and infrastructure today. We've got quite a lot to cover. So thank you very much for coming. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Start with Alan.
Morning, I'm Alan Over, I'm Director General for Major Rail Projects.
Conrad Bailey, Director General for Public Transport and Local.
Peter, Lord Hendy of Richmond Hill, I'm the Minister of State for Rail.
Good morning, Alex Hynes, I'm the Director General of Rail Services at the Department for Transport.
Great. So, Minister, you've got extensive experience in railways. So how does that background inform you in your new role as Minister for Rail?
So I think the first thing I should do is to congratulate you and the committee for acceding to these valued places. Well, it's very kind of you to say I've got extensive experience. I am very pleased to be here. I hope to bring that experience, such as it is, to the government's policy and delivery of on the National Railway Network.
Right. Okay. So we always, or usually, ask ministers this question: your vision for the railways by the end of this Parliament, which I guess in the history of the railways is but a blink of an eye. What's your vision for rail in the next 5 years?
So, the railway system doesn't function in the way that it should. It's quite clear about, we're quite clear about that. I think the public are quite clear about it. The railway deserves to be more reliable. It should be generating more revenue and it should cost less. You referred to my experience. I was the chair of Network Rail for 9 years. For 6 of those, we were waiting for rail reform. It didn't happen with the last government. This government is committed to reforming the railway. I'm very pleased to be part of that process. By the end of this Parliament, we should have a railway that's more coherent, serves passengers better, costs less for the taxpayer and generates more revenue. I think those are worthy objectives and I believe we can get there.
Thank you. I'll now go to Ollie, question 2.
Thank you, Chair. Last Friday there was an industry-wide incident relating to the GSMR radio system. Are you confident that the rail network is well prepared for system-wide outages or issues of that nature in future?
So I am familiar, as a lot of travellers are, with the outage last Friday. I checked myself, actually, about how badly it affected travel. I think the publicity was somewhat in advance of the actual effect of it. Many trains were a few minutes late, but it didn't seem to affect the service as badly as was portrayed. Alex, do you want to come in and say more about it?
Yeah, well, just to say, this was a failure of the system to auto-register, so drivers had to do it manually. This is the system which enables drivers and signallers to talk to each other. And Network Rail has already done a lessons learned with its suppliers and will implement the recommendations of that. So I actually spoke to Andrew Hynes, the CEO of Network Rail, on this topic yesterday.
Do you think that there are any wider learnings about the resilience of the system to things like, not necessarily GSMR, but the system as a whole, the resilience to things like cyber attacks, etc.? How confident are you that the industry has good plans to deal with those sorts of challenges?
So it's quite, I'm trying to find the right word for it. It's quite a dispersed system. There are very few systems that cover the whole railway in the way that the radio system does, and what Alex described is very exceptional. The signalling system is a mixture of technologies and a mixture of ages of technologies. So, I think the experience is that the railway system is actually quite resilient. But we're not complacent. If you look at the cyber attack on Transport for London, which has been very serious and has gone on now for a very long time, there clearly are some lessons to be learned, and it's right that the railway industry should learn them. I don't know whether any of my colleagues would want to add anything to
Well, only to say that obviously cyber risk is up there on our risk register, and the department works with the industry on managing those risks. Obviously, given the nature of the threat, probably best dealt with in private rather than in public.
Okay. Rebecca, did you want to come in?
Yes, great. So in a way, this should probably be our last question because it's the one that talks about Christmas, and that usually tends to be how we head out the door, but we don't want to miss it because it's important. Obviously, we've had the disruption with the weather, which we can't do much about, but historically rail services at Christmas are massively disrupted because I recognise that it's a great opportunity for work to be done on the track. But given the push across the whole country, I think, to ensure that we are using the trains more, clearly when there's a real lack of service at Christmas, that forces people into their cars potentially when they could be using rail and things like that. So what reassurances can you offer rail travellers over the Christmas period that I suppose the work being done is absolutely essential, but also that this potentially gets us to a position where in the future this won't be as necessary to get the work done that needs doing?
So I certainly won't bore you with my detailed knowledge about what's happening at Christmas, but you're right to recognise that Christmas is a good time to do major engineering work because the demand is lower and over several days. And we do have a very detailed schedule of it, and I'm already familiar with it myself. There are two aspects really, one of which is the work going to finish on time. Famously, I wasn't at Network Rail in Christmas 2014 when it failed to finish on time outside King's Cross, but the lessons of that were very severe, and the rail industry has, and Network Rail in particular, has worked extraordinarily hard not to replicate that again because it was disastrous for passengers. The other feature, though, is staffing or Christmas services, which I've been into a lot with Alex recently and will continue to be into right up to and over Christmas. And that we are concerned about with several train operators, exacerbated by the fact that inevitably the closures close parts of the railway and put more pressure on others. So maybe I should turn to Alex and get him to talk in more detail about what we're worried about and what we're doing.
Yeah, so obviously if we want to make the railway better, we have to sometimes sadly close it. And actually some of the big engineering work which is happening this Christmas is just to do that. So the electrification of the Midland Main Line, for example, means we've got a closure on the Midland Main Line. We're building a new high-speed station at Old Oak Common, which means sadly we have to close the Great Western Main Line. But in that scenario, we've worked with the operators and Network Rail, Great Western Railway, to divert services into Euston Station so we can keep passengers on trains rather than rail replacement buses. It's also probably worthwhile saying that, of course, the vast majority of the rail network is open this Christmas. And customers should check before they travel, obviously, but most of it is open. No trains run on Christmas Day and very few trains run on Boxing Day, so it is a golden opportunity to get in and do this essential work without disrupting passengers. And obviously we have to recognise that we've got the oldest railway in the world. We have to carry on renewing it, and Christmas is a great time to do it. But certainly the passenger handling of these closures is right up there at the top of our agenda. And the industry has established its strategic coordination team. So that's Network Rail working with the train operating companies and the department. It's meeting twice weekly to make sure that we're managing these issues as they arise.
Can I ask one quick additional point on that? What have you done in terms of increasing capacity on the lines that are going to be closing so that on those last few days that people need to travel, there's potentially enough space? Because I'm sure we've all been on trains at Christmas where it's standing room only. You've got that team meeting twice a week. Is capacity increasing part of that solution?
So it is, as is looking at how forward bookings are working. So this week we've been reviewing in the department the forward bookings for Great Western, for LNER, for Avanti. Plenty of capacity still available left on Avanti. Where the resources are available, train operating companies will provide Christmas extras, but as the Minister says, generally as a system we're over-reliant on overtime working for train crew. That's a risk which may be worse at Christmas time than other times, and therefore we need to make sure we've got the infrastructure and the trains and the crew to operate those additional services. That may or may not be the case, but certainly operators are well placed for the Christmas dash. Christmas falls on a Wednesday this year. We're expecting the Christmas getaway to be a wee bit smoother than perhaps other years.
Okay, right, thank you. Now let's move to rail reform, Steph.
Thank you. Yes, rail nationalisation is a thing. I think we're all interested in the detail of the timing of the steps that are being taken, and in particular what preparations specifically are underway for bringing operators like South Western Railway into public ownership. And also, I guess, more broadly, what can passengers of publicly owned rail operators like Northern Trains expect to see different, and when?
So the Secretary of State made the announcement about the first 3 train operators last week now, I think. South Western, C2C and Greater Anglia in the autumn. So the preparations to do that are continuing in the department, and we can talk a bit about what those preparations are. The purpose of public ownership is as part of rail reform. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And firstly, you would want, or we do want, at the point of transfer for it to be smooth, for passengers not to suffer any detriment because of it. But subsequently, taking these operations into public ownership will lead us into a position where we've got more direct control, and we can begin to implement some of the aims of rail reform, which is to make track and train closer together. So there's every reason why we should do that. The programme has to be smooth because there's quite a lot of administrative and managerial work to do it, and we're looking to progressively transfer these train companies over the next 2 to 3 years. We also, I have to say, have to leave a bit of room and a bit of space and a bit of capacity for the possible eventuality that one or more of the existing franchises perform so badly that it fails the contractual test and has to be taken back. There's been a lot of debate. I had a lot of debate with my colleagues in the Lords about the sequencing of this. Sadly, the generally accepted the worst 2 performers in private ownership are the 2 last ones in the sequence of dates, but we'll see. We have to leave ourselves some space to be able to do that. Alex, do you want to say some more about it?
Well, I mean, just to say that obviously the department has geared up already to deliver the public ownership transition programme. We have a director responsible with lots of resources to make sure that we're well equipped to deliver this rolling programme of public ownership. We've got 10 of these train operating companies to return to public ownership over the course of the next 3 years, so the department needs to resource itself for that, and we are. The second issue is the capability of the DfT Operator Limited Company, which of course will become the new owning group essentially for these businesses, and they're in the process of rapidly increasing their capability and their capacity. So they're historically a very small company, but their headcount is going from 25 to 100 by the end of next year. So they have the ability to own and improve these organisations. Obviously, improvement is absolutely critical, particularly at South Western Railway, where we think performance could be better. And as the Minister says, that's public ownership is part of rail reform, because ultimately we're going to integrate track and train and have a directing mind for these bits of the railway.
Yeah. Last couple of supplementaries. Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. And in my constituency, Greater Anglia is pretty well regarded, actually. So you're bringing in a good one, and of course there's already some good capacity inside of the operating company because of the improvements we've seen in the already publicly taken over railways. I guess my 2 supplementaries would be: are there plans to possibly bring some of these franchises into public ownership before their contract end dates, and is there any legal risk around that? And just again to push you on the really vernacular changes. Let's imagine I'm a customer of Greater Anglia, and for the record, I am already pretty happy. What things will I be able to see and do and experience that are just not possible under private ownership, but you would hope would be possible under this new structure?
So the contract end date point, the government is quite clear that it doesn't want to expend any money on this. We don't want to compensate people for broken contracts or contracts terminated prematurely. So the programme is carefully organised so that it doesn't prematurely terminate contracts, except in the case where the performance is so poor that we should do something about it. We of course don't expect competently run train operators to get worse. We do expect improvements in performance, as Alex says, on ones that we believe can perform better. The performance of the 4 that are in public ownership already is not particularly a guide to the performance of ones that will be brought in, if only because all those 4 were brought in circumstances of distress, really, either performance distress or commercial distress, that's not necessarily the case with the 10 that are coming. One of our objectives is to get track and train closer together. I doubt whether there's any disagreement round in the room about the desirability of doing that. And the frictional costs of the contractualisation of train operations is quite considerable. We believe that there are serious savings to be made in terms of management, in terms of better performance, in terms of reduced cost, and of course actually public ownership will enable that to be done. One of my personal objectives is that I would like to see somebody who's actually responsible for the train operations, the staff, the rolling stock and the infrastructure. Now, I'm not familiar with that on the National Railway System because that's been the 30 years worth of balkanisation, but in terms of my previous career at Transport for London, it was self-evident that actually if something went wrong with the underground, you could summon the managing director and say, let's fix it. Now, we have that opportunity coming, and my ambition is to get there as quickly as possible, because actually that will enable a better service of passengers, more reliability, reductions in cost, and the management more capable of generating revenue, which is all good for the railway.
But public ownership in itself isn't the golden ticket. As people keep reminding us that there are public ownership, nationalised rail systems in other countries that aren't delivering in the way that your vision has described. So what are the risks of nationalisation, and what are you learning from other countries to ensure the same doesn't happen here with GBR?
Well, clearly there are risks in the process of taking these operations over. As Alex described, we're boosting up what was called the directly operating, the operator of last resort, which is now being called the DFT operator because it's not the last resort. And the transfer of it does have to be done carefully, it has to be done sensitively, and it has to be done in order to preserve the existing performance of the railway. With a view to improvement. The position of other publicly owned railways across Europe and across the world, I mean, some of their histories are very different. Deutsche Bahn used to be held up as a brilliant example of a well-performing railway. It's far from that at the moment. A lot of this is actually about management. Some of it's about funding. I think that actually one of the opportunities here is to bring on a new generation of managers who understand much more completely the whole business of the railway. The balkanisation of the railway for 30 years has created a generation of people who are largely only familiar with either the operation or the infrastructure. Sitting to my left is a gentleman who ran the Scotland's railways, who ran both, and we watched, he was a Network Rail employee when I was the chair, we watched Scotland's railways being very successful because of bringing these functions together. I think there's quite a lot of learning in that process. I'm sure Alex will tell you if I'm not saying anything he agrees with, and that I do think is a good model.
Ask one more. Yes, thank. I really appreciate your candour so far. It all makes sense to me, and the opportunity to de-balkanise from a management structure point of view is plainly makes sense in and of itself. I guess I'm again thinking about people who are watching this hearing and using the railways and all of the sort of wild assumptions that come to mind when you think about nationalisation. Is there a hope that there is a de facto customer experience benefit to all of this, even in Greater Anglia's case? What might that be?
Absolutely. Well, the railway's got to run better. Let me say, the previous Secretary of State was, as the present one is, was determined to improve the performance of the railway. So very early on, she summoned both the Managing Director of Avanti and the Network Rail Route Director to talk about performance. Since then, I've seen several pairs of people in my office talking about what they contribute to the passengers' experience of using their railway. Those sessions have been very revealing, actually. In one of them, I had one of the parties giving me a very optimistic account of how closely they work together, where the other one, the person was shaking their head in disbelief. These were the two people who together were providing a train service for a significant area of the country. I'm not going to say where. That was very revealing to me, and what that showed me is that actually you need managerial coherence to produce the output. The infrastructure is one thing. The infrastructure does fail occasionally. Alex has already talked about, and I'm sure we'll talk about again, the levels of staffing. But actually you want somebody to be in charge of this lot to actually balance the thing out so that the service to passengers is the best it can be. And if we don't achieve that, then actually none of this will be worth it, will it?
Okay, I saw Scott and then Ollie.
Thank you. Two quick questions, I think. As a user of LNER, I know that we're already partway through this process, and I think LNER, for me, it's a fantastic service. So I want to see more services like that. But of course, not all the services currently in public ownership are running as well as LNER is. So in this interim period, as we bring these operating companies in-house, if you like, what lessons can we learn from the ones that are already in the stable?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think actually LNER is widely acknowledged to be a very good service. We will, I'm sure, talk about Northern Trains more than once here. Yep. And I had one of the sessions that I previously described with the management of Northern Trains and the relevant Network Rail Route Director, and simply getting to the bottom of the number of industrial disputes that they had, which they were managing, was a complete revelation to me. One of them is so old that it started before the limitation on strike ballots. It started in 2017. There's a huge amount of work to do, and I think there's a big difference between the previous government managing these things because they'd fallen into their hands and where we are now, which is trying to transform them into a decent service. There's a hell of a lot of work to do. And actually, one of my lessons out of this is that railway management can become seriously distracted and actually not address customers, and because of the underlying difficulties of actually performing what they're supposed to do. And I think, Alex, well, you, I, and a lot of others have put a lot of effort into these companies, and that's not finished yet. We've sorted out the drivers' issues at Northern. Some of the conductors' issues, especially in northwest England, are proving to be intractable, and we are determined to do that, because if you can't operate a reliable service, then what's the railway for?
That sounds like a cultural issue rather than a systems issue, which is actually quite difficult to tackle, I guess. So good luck. You've been speaking, if you don't mind me saying, in quite subjective terms about the need to improve the railway, greater revenue, better customer experience. As we go through this process, will there be actual KPIs that we can measure success against?
So absolutely right. The way in which we're thinking about rail reform is to have a strong passenger standards authority that will actually champion the needs and the rights of passengers, and for the railway to address customer performance by the use of metrics and account for its performance on a regular basis. I think that's absolutely essential. I have an ambition which the previous Secretary of State shared, and I think the present one does as well, as the railway publicising its performance on a regular basis to its customers on its stations. And what I would want is not only to publicise what's happened, but a commentary from the people in charge saying what they're going to do about it. I think those are reasonable entitlements, and we're working towards that now, and that can happen well before we actually get to railway reform.
Thank you.
Do you still have a question? Yep, Ali?
Something that a lot of people in the rail industry feel and say is that one of the reasons why the rail industry has not been making the progress is because of micromanagement on all the wrong things from Department for Transport and a lack of leadership on the right things. Is that a characterisation you'd recognise? And if you do, how will GBR and the reform avoid having even more centralisation and micromanagement?
Well, I'll turn to Conrad in a moment. Philosophically, the railway is very, very close to government at the moment. I haven't had such detailed information or interest in a series of industrial disputes for, crikey, 10 years. And you're right that actually the consequences of the way that the railway is run through COVID has meant that the department is taking very detailed decisions because it's public money. The intention of GBR is to have a strong public body which is accountable to the Secretary of State, but which is one step away from her, and to run the railway as a coherent whole and need less attention from both ministers and the department. Conrad, do you?
Thank you. So I think your point there about the sort of post-COVID world really drew the department much more into the railway. At the heart of the sort of philosophy of creating GBR and indeed moving through public ownership is that the department needs to fundamentally change. We need to see that level of detailed engagement with the railway, going back to the railway's leadership, to GBR. And one of the things we did actually just prior to the election with Alex's arrival was sort of begin that process of separating out the bit of the department that focuses on the operational railway, that in time will be part of Great British Railways, and those bits that need to provide the strategic direction, support ministers, which work to me and Alan. So we're very much already on that journey, but we do need GBR to be established to really set that out in a way that GBR can act as a integrated directing mind, because if it always comes back to the Department for Transport, we will simply not be able to deliver those benefits that we really need to do, both from a perspective of the railways leadership, but also because we need much greater influence and engagement between the railway and our local partners, be they mayors or other local authorities. So we make sure that the railway is really delivering what people need in the places they live and the places they need to travel to get to education, healthcare, jobs. And at the moment, the railway is too detached from the localities it serves.
Can I just one more thing, if I may, to the very helpful remarks that Conrad has made. This railway is so difficult to manage that a vast number of people in it spend all their time trying to make it work in this complex matrix of contracts. That to be successful, GBR has to lift its head up and look actually at what passengers and freight want and address the needs of the country. The railway is not an end in itself. The connectivity drives economic growth, jobs and housing, and actually one of the things that's missing here is the railway addressing those needs through better performance, much more successful in the future than it's done in the past. And I feel very strongly about it. I spent 9 years at Network Rail adding the first paragraph to documents, which is not how it works, but what it's for. And you're all here because of what the railway delivers for people. It's really important that we re-establish that focus.
Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to follow up on the comments you made, Minister, about wanting the new body to be arm's length, and the last deliberate attempt perhaps to set up an arm's length structure was the Strategic Rail Authority, and I think it's fair to say that independence, because circumstances changed, came to be seen as a problem in Westminster and in Whitehall. So I was just wondering if you could comment on what lessons have been learned from that historical experience and how confident you are that a similar dynamic can be avoided this time?
Yes, you're right. And actually the SRA was not successful because in the end the government curtailed its independence because it wanted more control over it. I ran Transport for London for 9.5 years for 2 mayors. I've chaired Network Rail for 9 years. And I think if you're in that position, you should never ever forget that you're appointed and you're reporting to people who are elected. They change from time to time, their attitudes change and what they want from you changes. And I think it's quite feasible to have a public body which is attentive to the needs of government whilst taking the responsibility for delivery itself. I don't always think it's easy. My hair was a very different colour when I started at TfL 18 years ago. But I think it's really important for the people who do those jobs to remember who they report to and what they're there to do. And I suspect I wouldn't either go into the personalities or the detail, but I think it's common cause that the SRA got rather a long way from the government it reported to, and in the end the government decided it would rather do its job itself. I don't think that's terribly helpful.
Thank you. That's useful.
Sorry, Conrad?
Yes, sorry,
I was just going to add a point directly on the SRA, but also on our sort of learning. We spent a lot of time, as we've been thinking about reform, looking at those lessons from the SRA. It felt like a structure that didn't have the flexibility to adjust to the times, as Lord Hendy was saying. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about the sort of governance and accountability structures, how we make sure the body is both able to lead the railway, but also responsive to ministerial and parliamentary needs. We've also looked at other reform programmes. So we looked at, for example, the NHS reforms of the early 2010s to learn some of those lessons. And we spoke to both those on the NHS side and those in the Department of Health side. So we've really tried to understand how you build sufficient flexibility into a structure whilst also making sure it can be, it can function clearly and the accountabilities are clear.
If you mean the Lansley reforms, I'm not sure. I think many people would say they'd be an example of how not to do a reform.
We've looked at the reforms from both the perspective of what's worked, but also absolutely what hasn't worked.
Good to know. Okay, let's move on to GBR. Baggy.
Brilliant, good timing. So it's our understanding that the department will be consulting on the railways bill that will establish Great British Railways, headquartered obviously in the brilliant Derby. What will the consultation involve? Who will be consulted, and what's the sort of timescales involved?
Well, this is a really serious change to the structure of the railway. So, in order to do what we want, we have to have a profound change in the way that the railway works. And in particular, there are issues about access and charging, which will be matters of legitimate concern, if only because there will continue to be commercial operators on the railway. Those are two examples of what we will consult about, so that all the interested parties can understand how the railway will work in the future, how it might affect them if they're a business, how it'll interact. Conrad's already mentioned the interaction with combined authority mayors and devolved administrations and so forth, and that too will be consulted over, because we've got to get their involvement in the railway right if we want it to work for both them, their constituents, and the railway itself. So those are examples of what's in the consultation. Conrad, do you want to say some more?
So, as the Minister said, we need legislation to establish Great British Railways, but also to establish the Passenger Standards Authority. We'll be consulting on how we go about establishing Great British Railways so it can deliver those things that the government set out it wants it to be able to deliver. A reliable railway, an affordable railway, an efficient railway, a high-quality railway, an accessible and safe railway. We'll be consulting on how we establish the Passenger Standards Authority, how that brings together functions that are currently in Transport Focus, in the Office of Road and Rail, the regulator, so that some of their consumer functions, and also the Rail Ombudsman, so there's a single sort of one-stop shop for consumers who may have concerns about the railway, but also a body that can really hold Great British Railways to account for really caring about the consumer. We'll talk about how access to the railway is governed for GBR operators for those belonging to the devolved administrations, but also open access and freight operators. And so we'll be setting out the consultation there. We'll be aiming to get views from a wide range of interested parties, not only those in the railway, but critically those who are served by the railway, because this piece around devolution is really at the heart of it, in order to introduce the legislation during this parliamentary session.
Okay, so Keith Williams' plan was, over 4 years ago now, and my question was around timescales. And do we think the bill will pass or be brought this Parliament, or so can you give us a bit more details on when?
Right. So we're expecting, the bill was obviously in the King's Speech, so we'd expect it to be introduced this parliamentary session. As soon as we've then got the bill through Parliament and we've had royal assent, and it's not for me to judge how quickly it will go through Parliament, we'll then want to set up both GBR and critically the Passenger Standards Authority as quickly as possible thereafter. There are certain things you can't do until you've got that royal assent, so there is a period we'd expect there to be a gap, but very much in the course of this Parliament.
Okay, you wanted to ask a quick supplementary, Scott?
Yeah, thank you. Lord Hendy, in your earlier answer to my question about the challenges ahead, you focus on some of the cultural issues, the relationships with trade unions and disputes, etc. So is this consultation a chance to work closer with the trade unions to try to get a better workplace for them as well? I mean, TSSA wrote to, I think, all the committee members yesterday following the death of a worker on the Elizabeth line last week, highlighting some of the risks that staff face every day in terms of their interactions with staff. Is this consultation, can this be a starting point for those better relationships and a better workplace for staff to work in as well, a safer workplace?
So I should say on behalf of us all that the death of any serving rail member of staff is a tragedy.
Just sub judice, so be very careful what you say, Minister.
That was all I was going to say, but I think it's important to say it's clearly a tragedy. The consultation itself is about the content of the future bill. But your question is wider, which is about the wider climate of employee and industrial relations on the railways, and I think there is a real opportunity there. One of the things that the previous Secretary of State did very early on was to settle two major pay disputes with the two major unions, and that was the right thing to do because it left the employees very unhappy, it left the railway staff very unhappy, but the consequence of the dispute also devastated the levels of service, which is clearly unsatisfactory. And I think there's a real opportunity going forward to work with the staff and the trade unions rather than against them, which was the climate of the current in the previous government. That doesn't mean that we'll unnecessarily concede things which will cost money, but it does mean that the people who work on the railway, who can contribute a huge amount to customer satisfaction and actually see the railway at work on day to day, can and ought to be involved in its future in a way that actually hasn't happened. One of the most common things that I've seen in my time at Network Rail, which itself in railway terms is a pretty transitory body, it's only 20 years worth, and it took over from Railtrack, which had a terrible terrible reputation, a rather short life. But on the operating front, most people with any length of service have worked for more than one set of management, more than one apparent company, and in fact the staff themselves have far more stability than the organisations for which they've worked. I think that's not helpful. It's not helpful for industrial relations, it's not helpful for the performance of the railway, and I think one of our intentions should be in this to make sure that there is some stability there, and that we can get on with dealing with the workforce and their representatives in a more collaborative way.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. It's really picking up the thread from Baggy's questions about the forthcoming legislation. Obviously, we have the previous government's draft rail reform bill in the public domain. How much of that new legislation is likely to be carried over from that previous work by the former government, and how much of that material should we expect to be new?
Well, I'm I'm not convinced myself that the previous government ever really intended to enact that. I think the consultation process put something in the public domain which looked as though something was going to happen. And indeed, my last appearance at the previous committee was to discuss that on the day, I think it was the day, either the day or the day before the election was called. And of course, it never went anywhere. I think what I would say is that this is a more comprehensive proposition to reform the railway than that bill represented. Conrad can probably comment more than I can about the level of work which is now going on in order to produce a comprehensive reform of the railway. Some of it will, of course, be the same. The name Great British Railways is going to be adopted, but this is more comprehensive, more far-reaching, and I think I would say it's going to be more successful. Conrad?
Yeah. So, as officials, we clearly learned from all the feedback we got on the previous consultation, and we've thought about that. But as Lord Hendy says, this is a fundamentally different piece of legislation. We've got a passenger standards authority. That was not something that was considered previously. That changes the role of the regulator. I think we've got much greater clarity around the role of GBR as a directing mind, not a guiding mind. So that's another difference, and that actually changes how you think about the accountability structures for GBR, its relationship with the Department for Transport, the relationship with the regulator. So those are just examples of where I would expect this consultation and then subsequently legislation to feel quite different. But clearly, we're going to make the most of the feedback we got on the consultation previously, and we're reflecting on that in our thinking about the new legislation.
Thank you. And we heard from the previous Secretary of State recently that a lot of work had already been done in opposition on the design of GBR. So what decisions, if you like, are still being made? What I'm trying to get at is not maybe so much matters of implementation that are still being worked on, but what policy decisions are still being weighed up as you develop that legislation?
Well, the advantage of this government is that the Labour Party produced a very substantial piece of work before the election, which clearly set out a number of the details of where it wanted to go, and I think that's helpful because it must be much easier to turn that into legislation and then into the organisation that we want than it would have been if that hadn't existed. But I started by referring to the detailed matters of access and charging, simply because there is a lot of detail there, and a lot of that detail has to be understood during consultation by the people who will be affected by it. And I think it's fair to say, Conrad, that we are having a lot of discussion to make sure that when the consultation goes out, it is substantive enough for people in the freight sector and the open access sector and others who need to know to understand what we're proposing. Is that fair comment?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we need it to be a consultation people can properly engage with and give us their thoughts and feedback back on. And obviously we've based our work very much on the clarity the incoming government gave us through the Get Britain Moving document that was published in opposition.
I'm keen that we get through the whole spread of things, so if you could keep your answers briskly to the point, I'd be very grateful. Baggy, could you?
Yeah, sure. So the shadow GBR team, what do you expect they will do that the GBR transition team aren't doing or can't do?
So the GBR transition team was a creature of the previous government's desire or stated desire for reform, but latterly it turned into a body that was pursuing separate and individual work streams, some of them very useful, fares ticketing and so on. Shadow GBR, which is chaired by Laura Schoaf, who, I'm sure she's not known to many of you. She will be shortly because she's coming, I think, to talk to you. We don't need to wait for GBR to do quite a lot of things. Between Alex's part of the department, between Network Rail and between what was the operator of last resort, which is now DFT operations, there's a substantial body of work and knowledge on the railway which can be harnessed to lead some of the changes we want to do now. And in particular, there's a cultural change of bringing people together. This is going to be an enormous change to the philosophy of running the railway, and I'm completely supportive, as the previous and current Secretaries of State are, of starting the work on the culture of the railway to make sure that as we bring it together, it does operate in the right way, and that the contractual shackles are set to one side, and actually people genuinely work together to produce a better service.
Okay, so on Laura's role specifically then, how will that work, and what are the reporting structures would be for that?
She's doing 1 or 2 days a week. She sits with Alex, with Robin Gisby from DFT Operations, with Andrew Hynes from Network Rail, and together they're working through a programme of work to address the issues that I've described as much as is possible in the current organisational circumstances, so we don't have to wait for GBR. And because, as Conrad said, it can't be set up until the legislation's got a long way through. We can establish its culture. We can establish, the means of working together now. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do.
And will she have, or is there no plans for having sort of permanent staff, a chief executive, to drive ultimately improvements for passengers?
It has to be currently the powers of the individuals. Alex's responsibilities as Director General, Robin Gisby's as the Chief Executive of DFT Operations, and Andrew Hynes as the Chief Executive of Network Rail. That's where the power is, but you can bring it together and make things happen regardless. We're not setting up another organisation in advance of GBR because we couldn't. You need the legislation to do that, but we can get collaborative working together, and that's what this is designed to do.
But the plan is it'll feel smooth, but because it's the legislation, you're waiting for us in Parliament to actually do the formalities, and yourself as well.
Indeed. I mean, this is a really substantial change, and the legislation is a big piece of work. But we don't need to wait to work out how to make it work in detail. And indeed, I think there's a lot we can do. We own 4 of these train companies already. We're going to have. By the end of this year, by the end of next year, we'll have probably 7. So why don't we introduce some of this the culture of collaborative working, of working together for the benefit of better performance, reduced costs and increased revenue? Why don't we do as much of that as we can on the way? And that's what she and Alex and his 2 colleagues are there to do.
Okay, you done another one, Baggy?
I think just leading into the final question 8 then.
Yeah, go on.
And I think you've touched on this, so will the GBR transition team continue to be funded and staffed in parallel to the shadow shadow GBR? So
it has to evolve. I'll come to Conrad just briefly, but it has to evolve. There are some things going on there which are really useful. The fares and ticketing work is one of them. Another is the production of the first proper profit and loss account for the whole of the British railway system for 30 years, broken down into individual pieces. That's clearly a useful management tool if you can run the railway in an integrated way. So that work is neither wasted, nor will some of it stop. But Conrad, do you want to say a little more?
So we're currently discussing with ministers exactly what happens to GBRTT in the detail, but as the minister said, a lot of the functions and people within it are absolutely vital to this reform journey on fares and ticketing, on the profit and loss, on actually understanding what's happening to revenues across the system, so we can really get that insight. And we're certainly anticipating continuing to fund that activity over the coming year or years.
Okay.
Okay, now let's move on to passengers.
Passengers, thanks. If all this stuff works, will it one day bring about cheaper tickets, more trains, or is it just about making the railway less rubbish?
Was that the same?
Gosh, there's a prejudicial description. Well, look, the first thing to do is to make the railway run reliably. it isn't reliable everywhere, every day. It could be better. We all know it could be better, and that is a primary intention. The fares levels are, of course, a product of some political choices about the balance of cost of the railway paid by fare payers and the taxpayers. Fares have generally risen by around about inflation for many, many years, and the cost of the railway is no secret following COVID. The railway costs more than, well, the railway costs, the net cost of the railway is more because the revenue is depleted and the cost of running it currently are the same. So there's some big things to attack there well before you go on and say we want it to be better. But of course we do want it to be better. We want the services to more fulfil the needs of the people who use the railway. And certainly my belief, and that of the Secretary of State, is that the GBR methodology is much more likely to produce us a more coherent service addressed to the needs of the customers than it would be without. There are some limitations on railway capacity. Parts of the railway are very, very full of trains. The methodology of establishing the best timetable is extraordinarily clunky at the moment, and actually nobody really has control in the end over deciding what to do, as can be seen by the saga of the East Coast Main Line timetable. All of that could be better. I think those are worthy objectives to start with, but I also think that the consequence of GBR will be to address passengers' needs and freight better in the future than it's been done in the past.
So, if I may, you've got a chunk of money coming out of tax because it's costing more to run the railways than fare revenue. That's gone up because you wanted to rightly prop up the railways after COVID. Lots of these improvements could potentially bring in extra revenue, and from what you're saying, it's a political choice about whether the fares then come down because government sees the value of supercharging a growing industry of rail passenger.
Well, always there's a choice there. I mean, you know, but a better and more reliable railway will itself produce more revenue.
Yeah.
People are much more likely to travel if they believe that the service is reliable. One of the reasons for solving the recent industrial disputes was that those disputes were damaging people's confidence on the railway, and they were damaging the railway's revenue. We moved fast to fix it because that was the right thing to do.
And I guess that the incremental cost of, say, putting on an extra train at the end of the day isn't quite as simple as dividing the cost of each journey and just adding a cost to it. So
never.
There could be some benefits in terms of frequency and timetabling that actually are quite cost effective to achieve.
Always.
Yeah, I mean, the timetable changes on Sunday, and actually many operators are adding additional services because the railway is recovering, particularly, as the Minister says, since the resolution of the longest industrial dispute we saw ever on the rail network. So we're about 85% of pre-COVID journeys, and therefore revenue at same prices. Revenue is coming back quite strongly in some parts of the country, and that means that operators can meet that demand with additional services. Whether these services cover their costs or not generally is a function of where in the country they are. Yeah. So, you know, that's something that we manage within the department. The Minister mentioned East Coast Main Line timetable. Dr. Arthur mentioned earlier on the fantastic service that LNER offers. We're working on a new timetable for East Coast Main Line. The industry's made a recommendation for an improved timetable, and ministers are currently looking at that. So, as the post-COVID market bounces back, operators working with the department need to meet that demand because, frankly, we need the money.
Yeah. And you mentioned LNER. Any comments on their fare simplification thing? Was it LNER did the fare simplification?
Yeah, it is LNER. I mean, does simpler fares mean more expensive fares?
Not necessarily. Absolutely not necessarily. Simpler fares are incoherent. Passengers want simpler fares. People don't understand the way the railway works. The LNER fares proposition was designed to make it simpler. It is I don't know about experiment. It's a trial, I think, and it's taking some time. Alex, do you want to say more about it?
I mean, I think Conrad can come in on fares and ticketing reform, and particularly the single leg pricing trial.
I'm sorry, yeah.
And, essentially, LNER is trying to make fares and ticketing simpler because the complexity in itself is a barrier to travel. Yeah. And LNER is one of the operators which has seen one of the strongest post-COVID recovery in terms of journeys and revenue. So this is one reason why fares and ticketing reform is so important, because it is a generally well-held belief that the complexity in itself is a barrier, not just the price paid.
So on the LNER trials, still very early days in terms of the feedback we're getting from consumers, and also our understanding of exactly what's coming out. But the emerging position appears to be that customers have welcomed the simplification and what that's delivered. We're trying to look at two areas really of improvements to the ticketing experience for customers. So LNER is an example of what we're trying to do on long distance routes, working with operators to see if we can simplify options. The other thing we're doing is trying to introduce pay as you go for those commuter and nearer in journeys. We had a further rollout of pay as you go in the southeast that was due to happen earlier in the autumn. Sadly, it was one of the issues that was impacted by a cyber attack, so the cyber issues in TfL. But that should be back on track and should now happen early in the new year, and there will be further phases of that following through. We're also working on business cases with both Greater Manchester and the West Midlands to trial pay as you go, to bring more of that sort of London style experience to those areas, as well as mobile pay as you go trials, which will allow us to hopefully spread some of that benefit that you have if you use TfL in London to a much wider part of the country. So we're looking really at how we can do that. When you do these pay as you go trials, you also get to simplify the fares, and that's a real bonus for passengers, because it just makes it so much easier to understand what's going on when you're buying a ticket.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Just on fares and a bit that we haven't really asked about yet. Obviously there's a market for ticket splitting, but there are current routes, to my understanding at the moment, that you basically don't get to benefit from those. So for example, cross-country going up the west coast, you can split the fares and get a reasonable discount. If you're going across the country on Great Western, you generally don't benefit in the same way from that, chunking out your ticket and getting something cheaper. Is that something that you're going to look at going forward as well? Because again, it feels like there's a bit of a postcode lottery, depending on where you happen to live and who's running the train line, as to whether you benefit from those creative solutions.
I mean, it's part of the complexity, and it's part of the reason people don't like this thing, because it's quite hard to understand why these things should apply in some places and not in others. Conrad?
So it can't really make sense, can it, that you want to go from A to C and you buy a ticket from A to B and B to C. So actually part of our ambition for simplification is to mean things like split ticketing are not something that you need to do as a passenger, because it just adds complexity and confusion to your journey. So I think actually the good outcome is there's no consumer benefit from doing that, and that's very much the sort of thinking we would be trying to take.
Very quick point on that. I think another issue of split ticketing is, as I understand it, somewhat messes the data up in terms of how people are travelling, etc. It's another disadvantage of it.
Absolutely, and it's massively inconvenient.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
On a practical basis.
Rebecca again.
Yeah, so we're changing off fares and ticketing, onto more rail strategy. So in the last Parliament, the GBR transition team was preparing a long-term strategy for rail. What became of this, and when does the government plan to publish the strategy it wants GBR to work to?
I'll turn to Conrad.
So the team from GBRTT that was working on that is now working very closely with my Director of Rail Strategy. So we are pulling together some of the learning from that previous work, because the railway remains the same, and we're advising ministers on how we take forward a long-term strategy. Clearly, that long-term strategy is to inform GBR, which is still some time off. So I would expect it to be published certainly, probably once legislation has started moving forward a bit. But we're definitely working on it.
Any timescale?
So I think it really is a matter we're still discussing with ministers.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, we talked a little bit indirectly about kind of the role of the railways in infrastructure and growth, and I know we've talked a bit about this, Lord Hendy, in a previous meeting, but how is that strategy going to look at some of what was being done before, whether it's under the same title or not? So the Restoring Britain's Railways, for example, particularly around the growth agenda of housing and planning, because, you know, ultimately we don't want all the new homes to be built on the main line, we want them to be built on branch lines and things like that. So is that likely to form part of that strategy? And I think a sub-question on that as well is, what role will passengers have in developing that strategy? Because you've talked a lot about the passenger kind of charter or whatever, but obviously passengers get given the service that has been decided upon. Are we going to look more strategically at what passengers want, which then links into that housing and infrastructure piece?
So on the first, actually I've had, crikey, the new Secretary of State's been there nearly 2 weeks now. I've had 3 discussions with her already about making sure that the link between the government's ambitions on housing and on job creation are linked as far as possible into what the department does generally, and particularly on what we do with rail. There are some good pointers to that, actually. Some of the good work which has been going on with Network Rail Property and LCR to develop railway land on and around stations. It's an obvious place to put housing density, but there's far more that can be done. And one of our ambitions is to link how we develop the railway and its strategy with the government's growth and missions and housing. And I'm sure that when she comes in front of you, she will speak eloquently on this subject, as she's done to us already. So I am expecting this strategy to strongly relate to the wider government targets about housing and about industrial development. Conrad, about passengers?
Yeah, so about passengers, so obviously we'll work very closely with bodies like Transport Focus to make sure we've got that passenger insight. I think the other thing that we really will want to do is take the integrated national transport strategy that the previous Secretary of State recently launched, and make sure we're really thinking about people's journeys, because very few people, their whole journey is on a train. So really making sure we're getting that link between the place people need to travel from and the place they need to travel to. That link with the local is going to be really, really
as well,
absolutely key. And as Lord Hendy said, also working very closely with colleagues in MHCLG to make sure we've got that.
Okay, so sticking with strategy, open access and particularly freight are not included in GBR. So how will we be assured that they will get adequate priority in terms of their aspirations in the context of GBR being the overall guiding, overall controller of rail?
So, one of the reasons for the earlier discussion about what's in the consultation document is to make sure that the rules of access and charging for the railway infrastructure are suitable for those operations. The government has acknowledged the use of open access in developing services that would not otherwise have been developed on the railway, and that emphasis will continue in the right circumstances. There will be a target for freight growth, and we are particularly concerned to engage the freight community in this. The freight market has changed radically in recent years. The demise of coal, some of the reductions in the transport of basic materials have been offset by increases in containers and building materials and so forth, and it's really important that we do develop that. So part of the strategy will be to have a freight strategy, to have some strong actual resource within GBR, which will be developed from the resource there already is in Network Rail to support the freight community. And you're right that both of those are equally important actually in terms of developing the whole railway, because they're part of what the railway offers for the growth, jobs and housing agenda.
Right. So it's good that this government's freight strategy on freight is more ambitious than the previous government's. But I'm picking up a number of issues around network capacity, particularly certain junctions, which is HS1 into the main system, Ely Junction, depot capacity, which are constraining the ambition to grow freight, and freight doesn't just mean heavy good building materials, but it also includes logistics. That is, I think, a potentially growing subsector. So what's the ambition for addressing those network constraints, particularly the specific junction ones?
So freight is clearly a dynamic market. I saw Veramis, you might have seen them before. They're the people who probably best express the ambition into the transport of just-in-time parcels and logistics. Each of the current operators and potential operators has specific needs for the railway. One of the reasons for the freight unit in Network Rail, one of the reasons why GBR's got to have a strong freight unit, is in order to work on those granular issues, to develop the railway so that it's capable of actually carrying the increased freight that the government wants to see. There will be some infrastructure that needs to be provided, though there are changes in the market, so we need to reflect those. For example, the move of one particular shipping operator from Felixstowe to London Gateway will produce a change in the nature of freight traffic in that part of East Anglia, and we'll see what that does, for example, for the business case for Ely.
Okay. Ollie.
So on the subject of freight, earlier this year, Royal Mail announced they're withdrawing their Class 325 electric fleet for hauling their remaining freight by rail. Do you have any thoughts or concerns about that development?
Well, they're a private company. In the end, there were 6 out of 600 freight movements a day. So the romantic view of the carriage of mail bags by train on virtually every night train in Britain has long since expired, and they weren't using their existing fleet of trains barely at all. I think if they've decided their future is not in the railway, then it's up to people like Veramis and others who can spot a market in logistics transport, who may actually be interested in transporting more than one logistics operator's freight on the same train, and I predict there's quite a good future for that. In fact, I saw them yesterday. I'm not going to say what he said to me about the development of his business, but you'll no doubt see in due course that it's far from the case that there's no transport of that there will be no transport of small parcels by rail in the future. And in fact, I think that the railway has much to offer there, certainly in terms of some of the capacity in the major stations in London. The just-in-time delivery of people like Amazon is a very different experience than the old way of transporting letters and parcels, and some of the London stations and some of the big stations elsewhere are perfectly well suited to do what those sorts of people want, and I think you'll see that develop in the coming weeks and months.
Yes, gosh, might even call it Red Star, as British Rail once did. Do you think do you think we should be seeing more potential for rail freight on our rail network? Because as I understand it, our rail freight modal share is quite low compared to a lot of European countries.
I'm sure we should, and you know, it's partially about the entrepreneurial spirit of the freight companies and the freight that they can capture and the price they can offer it at. But it is, as we were discussing, also about new traffic. I mean, I think the one thing is that it won't be like Red Star. Red Star, you could take a parcel to a railway station and somebody would fill in the forms and send it. The modern method of logistics and distribution are people like Amazon who can fill trains full of stuff and distribute it at either end by a variety of means, including some environmentally friendly means in cities. And that is a different sort of traffic, but I'm sure that there's potential there. And in fact, you know, the witness is that there are people seeking to exploit it.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence.
16. Thank you, Chair. And it falls to me as a Birmingham MP to ask about the Trans-Pennine upgrade and the Northern programme. What version of the Northern Powerhouse Rail project is this government going to deliver, and to what timetable?
Well, the first thing to say is the government is actually delivering TransPennine Upgrade, which is I can't get the number right. I keep quoting 13 billion, but it may be 11 or 12, which is a substantial improvement to the capacity, line speed and so forth of the main railway between Manchester and Leeds. That is in progress as we speak, and indeed if the committee wanted to go and look at what was going on there at some stage, it should. It's a quiet transformation of what was a coal railway into the right sort of railway for to develop east-west travel across northern England, and it's going well at the moment. We don't often talk about projects that are going well, but TRU currently is. That, of course, is not the only ambition, and there's a lot of work going on in the department about developing better connectivity across the Midlands and the north of England. We are in the early stages of it because we are the victims, I think, of the previous government's 2 attempts at producing huge lists of infrastructure, unprioritised and uncosted, and actually that isn't the way to get any of this done. TRU is a sound start, and it's not the only thing going on in northern England, but it is the largest. It's the largest project outside HS2, but there's more to come. Alan, your part of the department's doing a lot of work on this.
Thanks, Minister. Yeah, there's clearly a manifesto commitment to improve northern connectivity, and the government's focused on that. And we need to get a programme of work with northern leaders to convert that ambition, which has good support locally and in central government, into a programmatised sequence of work. So we're looking at how we deliver the eastern section and the western section, and then build on top of the Leeds to Manchester TransPennine route upgrade. And what we need to do is to prioritise where the economic opportunities and the passenger benefits are needed, working closely with our colleagues in local government who understand those. So the commitments there in the manifesto, the commitments there in central and local political support, and our jobs to convert that into a deliverable programme. There will be choices. The previous government widened the geographic scope and the intended budget, but there will always be trade-offs between each pair of cities, or the interests of individual cities in getting regeneration there, but also the overall regional interest. And what we need to do is get the governance right to balance those interests, and that will require some difficult discussions regionally and between central and local government.
Thank you. And continuing the theme about the Midlands, 10 million people live in the Midlands, 50 million people live in the north of England, but we haven't always had 2/3 of the political attention or funding when it comes to rail infrastructure. And now I know that the department has funded some development work on the Midlands Rail Hub. And I saw last week some of the potential benefits that would be delivered in South Birmingham through the extension of Camp Hill services, and the potential to improve connections between East and West Midlands are really significant. So I wanted to ask, when are you expecting to be in a position to make a decision on capital funding for those projects? And although you're evaluating at the moment, do you think those aspirations are broadly in the right place?
So I too was on looking at the station development at Camp Hill. I think the week before last, and it's very good to see railway improvements actually being delivered. Clearly, the Midlands Rail Hub work is very important. It will enable more capacity because New Street is nearly full. You can't put too many trains into New Street. The whole of the railway network in central England falls down if you do. So there are some really beneficial things to be had through that project. The wider set of capital projects, the department was left with a very unenviable legacy, which was a large set of promises for a large number of projects without evidently the funding to deliver them. So that review is taking place currently. I have to say, sadly, not everything will be able to be done immediately, but that's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased, as I'm sure you are, to have seen the Camp Hill stations actually being built, because that part of it will be delivered. We'll have to come back in due course and say what the likely capital programme is, bearing in mind the general state of the public finances. But what is important, and I can give you some confidence of this, is that it's quite clear that projects like that do have growth, jobs and housing behind them, or rather in front of them as an objective, and therefore they do have strong business cases. The difficulty is in finding enough funding to do them all, but I hope that out of it we can produce a pipeline which demonstrates to people what is going to be done, and also incidentally suits the railway supply industry in terms of getting the cost down because of the continuity of supply, and also producing jobs and skills and all of the good things that come with it.
Minister, on the large number of promised but unfunded projects that many of us were promised from the last government, access for all, we're still waiting to hear from you about the timescale for those projects in our constituencies or affecting our constituents. Any timetable of when we're going to hear definitively whether we're going to get them or not?
So we weren't left with a very helpful inheritance there either, because there was a list of 50 which was published in the closing months of the last government, right, which was really a list of feasibility for 50. It wasn't really a list of 50 that were going to happen. It was a list of things that might be done if the feasibility proved to be. So we've got to work our way through that. The delivery, I'm sad to say, has not been quite as good from Network Rail as you might have expected, and if I'd still been here in my previous role, I would have been. I would have said that we could do better, and when you see Andrew Hynes next, he's taken the programme over himself in order to drive it forward. There will actually be quite a lot of accessible stations announced completed in the next year as a consequence of speeding up that programme. But it's one of the things that we do have to sort out, because an unachievable long list of promises is really unhelpful if in fact there's not the money or the capacity to deliver them. I'd say one other thing on this subject, which is that I think the industry has become rather too used to believing that accessibility can only be delivered with pairs of lifts and a bridge. And I've asked Andrew to go back and look again at those stations where accessibility improvements could be made without massive expenditure, in order to make sure that we're not missing some obviously small and cheaper things to be achieved.
Thank you. Right, Alex.
Okay. East West Rail recently set out a preference for discontinuous electrification. What do you think of discontinuous electrification as opposed to full electrification? And do you see that as an interim or as a long-term solution?
I think it's a brilliant solution. Having lived through the saga of the Great Western Main Line, which was extraordinarily expensive and probably overspecified, I think looking at electrification on a simpler, more practical way to produce decarbonisation benefits without massive capital expenditure in altering bridges and tunnels is absolutely fabulous. And I'm really pleased. There was a lot of comment about the methodology of powering East West Rail, and I think discontinuous electrification is a really good practicable solution, and the people who devised it need credit, as do the rolling stock companies who will produce rolling stock that will be able to use it. I don't know whether anybody wants to say anything else about it.
Just to say that at Transpennine they're now trialling a battery electric train, which is obviously the sort of train that you need to operate in a discontinuous electrification railway.
Sticking with East West Rail, stage 1 is starting very soon, so Oxford to Bletchley and Milton Keynes. Passengers are keen to know what the trains are going to look like. Are they going to be branded as East West Rail, or are they going to look like they belong to various different train operating companies when we've chosen them? Is that a ministerial decision, and do you have a view on it?
I'm not sure I can answer either of those two questions. Alex, where do you think that is?
As you say, Oxford to Bletchley is complete from a construction perspective, and next year we'll be operating services between Oxford and Milton Keynes. The first test train has already run, which is great news, that people can see progress on the ground. Our expectation is that we will contract with Chiltern Railway Company to operate that initial service, but those discussions are ongoing. I don't think there's any intention at the moment for another brand to be invented. We're trying to reduce the number of brands on the railway, not increase them. So we expect it to be branded by the operator.
You don't think that that might be a missed opportunity? Because in a sense, it's going to, if we don't brand them slightly differently, it's going to feel rather like the current trains that are there at the moment, as opposed to that ambition to get them to Bedford and on to Cambridge.
Well, I think the service strategy for the second phase and the third phase has not been entirely buttoned down yet. So I think that decision would be made in that context. This first interim phase obviously is an incremental change to the service from Oxford, albeit creating a direct link on that railway, which is great news for passengers. For stage one, it makes sense for us to procure the service through an existing operator.
And then just finally on East West Rail, the East West Rail Economic Growth Board, is it still a thing?
I believe so, yes. I mean, East West Rail essentially is a jobs growth and housing project. Mm-hmm. It has very strong support from across government, Treasury, MHCLG, because of the impact on growth and housing. And so that cross-government approach to this project is at the heart of it. And one of the things that really impressed me when I did a site visit of East West Rail recently was how the jobs, growth and housing elements are an integral part of the project. And actually I think other railway projects could learn from that. So both East West Rail Company have this vision, as does the government, and departments are working together to make sure we maximise the potential of this new railway.
Right. Okay, I do want to let Rebecca come in because I know she's got to leave early.
Thank you, Chair. It's just on the kind of infrastructure piece and which things are going to get funded and which are not, because I completely appreciate the fact that, you know, there was a lot of unfunded things in the past, but my understanding of how politics works and government works in the long term is that you find the money when you want it, and I'm assuming that most of what transport has needed has been so long term that often you set the vision and then the money kind of follows once you're there. So I suppose I'm interested in which projects will get support going forward, and I know again it's bringing it back to those smaller branch lines, the bits that ultimately, if there's a need for it, is it not something that we need to be finding the money for, rather than saying, well, that was a project from the previous government, so we're just going to scrap it. And I know we've talked about the ones down in Devon that potentially unlock a whole host of accessibility that removes the reliance on the main line along the seafront, etc. So how are we going to find the infrastructure changes that are needed rather than the ones that perhaps were politically driven in the past?
Well, I mean, clearly the whole of the capital review is seeking to sort out what is the best thing to do. One element is how much the government wants to invest. I'm not going to tell the Chancellor how much money she should allocate for this, but I will try, and we should be trying to persuade the government to fund the best schemes and to fund as much as it feels it can, because of the connection between that and growth and jobs and houses and the government's missions. Quite how we sort ourselves out in this. One of the characteristics that you always have to take into account radically is not just the choice of the next ones to do, but what the tail of expenditure on what we've already started is. Transpennine Upgrade is some way through a very major programme. It will produce major results. It will transform travel across the north of England from east to west. But once you've committed it, you've got to get to the end of it. And Therefore, there will be some very acute choices to be made, and the capital review which is going on in the department is attempting at least to find the best ways of allocating that money. I think more than that I really can't say for the moment.
Okay. Have you done for your questions?
That particular one, if you
to
want me to come in on the next one.
I know I'm just conscious of...
Probably 10 minutes, but that's okay.
Yeah, well,
I'll do it now and then we're done. So I suppose it is linked, but looking more at enhancements pipeline. So fairly straightforward question. Does the government intend to produce a long-term rail enhancements pipeline as well as the strategy?
Well, yes, it does, if only because actually there hasn't, but despite all sorts of promises in the past, there hasn't been one. One of the advantages of a chancellor who talks about a long-term investment strategy ought to be that we can produce an enhancements pipeline, which would be a consequence of the end of this capital review, which sets out what we're planning to do, when we're planning to do it, how much it will cost, and give particularly the supply industry some certainty in actually being able to plan its business to deliver it. I'm much more optimistic because of the attitude of this government towards long-term development than I was with the last government, frankly, in a different position. And of course, both the railway and the industry suffered from not having such a thing published, and from therefore the inability to predict how much would be spent and where and when. And it because you all know that these things take a long time and they cost a lot of money, the certainty in the supply chain is material to the cost and delivery of these things in a way that we have a great ambition to resolve.
Right, thank you very much. Now I'm going on to Catherine.
And I think that leads quite nicely from what you were saying, but I had a few questions on electrification to begin with. I wanted to start by asking what your assessment is as to why Great Britain has been so slow to electrify its network.
Well, one of the reasons is because it apparently costs so much, which is partially itself due to the lack of having a programme. I can ask Alex to come in because, interestingly, in Scotland, where the government was pursuing or has pursued a programme of electrification, it's quite clear to us from a railway point of view that the consequence of a continuous programme was to reduce its cost. So that's not so?
Yeah, exactly. So having a rolling programme of efficient electrification is our opportunity here. Obviously, as the Minister mentioned, we've learnt some hard lessons on electrification as a country in terms of Great Western Main Line, for example. But I'm pleased to say that industry working with government have improved since then. And actually, we are electrifying railways today. We're electrifying the Transpennine route. Yeah. We're electrifying the Midland Main Line route. And we do expect electrification to be part of the solution, both full and partial, as we discussed. But we must try and drive down the unit costs of electrification so we can afford a rolling programme.
You mentioned the Midland Main Line, and while there's still design work going on, I had understood that the practical electrification work for the stage it was at has now completed, and the end of the next tendering process won't be until September of next year. So I wondered if there's been any work in looking at the risks to the supply chain and to skills in making sure that we keep them in this country rather than being attracted to other countries.
So obviously we're electrifying the Midland Main Line between St Pancras, which was already electrified, up to Wigston in Leicestershire, and we're introducing the brand new electric hybrid trains next year, which will be great for passengers. Network Rail and the department are talking to the supply chain about the next potential phases of Midland Main Line electrification, Derby, Nottingham, Sheffield. Any decision around that will come out of the spending review. But Network Rail is talking to the supply chain, particularly around prices and tendering strategy for further phases of electrification, if we had the money to do so.
The practical work is finished at the moment. The only work is design work. So when we're now facing such a huge delay until the end of the tendering process, what is going to happen to those companies and to those skills?
We are electrifying railways in the UK. We're electrifying Transpennine route upgrade, for example.
So is that where they're going? They've gone from Midland to Transpennine?
So I'm not familiar with the detail. I'll need to talk to Network Rail about that. But obviously, what tends to happen with the electrification market is they tend not to be tied to a geographic area. They tend to move around the country depending on where the work is. But I think what this highlights is the need for a smooth rolling programme of efficient electrification, because that enables the supply chain to invest in the plant and the equipment and the skills that you need to sustain a rolling programme. So both on electrification and on rolling stock, that's one of our intentions, to have a more joined up strategy, which has been difficult within the fragmented railway that we currently have.
I'd be hugely grateful for a follow-up answer just in terms of that detail. But does that
I'll
mean...
just add a point. I mean, Alex, we're also letting the systems contracts now for HS2, of which a large part is catenary and electrification. So it's not putting that onto an old track, but it is the same skills and experience, and it will sustain a pipeline. Thank you.
It would be fantastic to get something in writing with that detail. But do you think that does the government intend to produce the criteria for how it's going to assess where to electrify next and in what order?
I think it's part of the overall capital review. I mean, there's an enormous temptation on the railway to keep talking about concrete things rather than what the government's intention is in various areas, and the missions, the growth and the jobs and the housing mission is what should drive activity. Also, the decarbonisation agenda should drive more efficient and practical ways of decarbonising the railway. The capital review will attempt to bring all these things together to produce a plan that's affordable, to do the right things in the right way. It's clearly not simple, otherwise somebody would have done it before. Looking at it in the long term is the right way of doing it, and hopefully we can come up with something that is both affordable, credible, and delivers what the railway should be delivering for the country.
Chair, I was going to move on to rolling stock, if that's all right, unless anyone else had anything on electrification.
Or capital.
Electrification.
Yes. Electrification.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. It's really good to hear about what Alex said about the experience of a rolling programme of electrification in Scotland, because I think sometimes we can focus too much on what's gone wrong in terms of Great Western rather than the lessons having been learnt from that and the potential for more. I just want to probe a little bit more about what you were saying about discontinuous or partial electrification compared to full. Are you clear on what criteria would be used to determine where you'd apply full electrification and where partial?
Well, practically, the partial electrification is all about actually the topography and the construction of the railway and the places that you're seeking to have, better decarbonised traction. So I think East West is a really good example of it. It's not entirely flat, but they're relatively long stretches where you can erect catenary fairly cheaply, and you can avoid the excessive expenditure in tunnels and existing Victorian structures. So, I mean, that's got to form part of it in the places where you're actually seeking to do it. On the other hand, I mean, if you look at the HS2 example, it's clearly not suitable for that sort of high-speed rail, as it probably wouldn't be in very dense urban environments with frequent commuter trains. I'm not sure, unless any of my colleagues can, that you could say much more about the detail. But actually, we've learned, even from the Great Western, which is far from the perfect project, we've learned quite a lot about it. I used to be a resident of Bath. My neighbours were almost equally divided between the desperate desirability of electric trains and the damage others thought would be done to a World Heritage City. Actually, we've got the train service, or rather the residents of Bath now have the train service. It's reliable, it's satisfactory. The wires never got there, but they're the benefits of electric traction for most of the journey. So, we've learned a bit out of this. And my prediction on East West Rail, for example, is that it's going to be a stunning success at a reasonable price.
As a user of that route, I would, and having seen the stats, I'd somewhat dispute the reliability thing about bi-mode Hitachi trains, but that's perhaps some detail for some other time. Just on East West Rail, the concern some might have is that the cost of equipping overhead electrification to what is in effect a greenfield site and building a new railway should be marginal compared to fitting it to an existing railway. And railways I'm aware of that have battery trains, it tends to be relatively low line speed, relatively low frequency, as opposed to East West Rail, which is proposed for 100-mile-an-hour operation and at least 4 trains an hour. Are there any risks or downsides to battery EMUs compared to lighter all-electric trains?
Well, this technology is constantly developing, as I can tell you from experience in a related sector, which is the development of hybrid and electric buses. You only get technical development if somebody is persuaded that the manufacture of what you want can be done. I think the development of battery powered trains is going through an enormous steep curve upwards in terms of what they're capable of and their reliability. And certainly the market is telling us, Alex, that feasibility is that the sort of discontinuous electrification of EWR is very feasible.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the full Oxford to Cambridge service won't be there until the mid-2030s, and given the rapid rate at which this technology is developing, we can expect the capability of these trains to be quite different then. But this is why things like the Transpennine trial are so important, because we've now got battery electric trains running around on the network, and so the results of the trial will be able to influence whether we electrify or not and what sorts of trains we apply. I think, building on the Minister's previous comments around electrification, I mean, density is clearly a criterion. Electric railways work good where there's great density. The other issue, of course, is freight. So, as I understand it, it's relatively difficult to decarbonise freight without full electrification, and so therefore potential freight use is also a factor when thinking about the long-term strategy of the railway.
Okay, thank you. Should we move on to rolling stock?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask what progress has been made to establishing a long-term rolling stock strategy and what the relationship this will have to the government's planned industrial strategy.
So I think the first thing to say is there has been no long-term rolling stock strategy, which is the cause of the immense angst and concern about the future of individual assembly and manufacturing plants. And we are now starting work, and Alex can talk about it, about such a thing, principally because it can't be right for the manufacturing industry to have such little knowledge about what the train operation might need and the replacement strategy. So that work is starting, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're in discussions with the Treasury on that. So, I mean, our previous comments around electrification sort of apply. There are parallels with rolling stock. Rolling stock investment was historically driven by the franchise bidding process. We went through a period a number of years ago where we had lots of rolling stock orders, lots of new rolling stock introduced onto the network, and then we had a relatively fallow period during COVID. And so the need for a longer-term integrated view of what we want to do with trains is important, because for a start we want to get better value, but we also need to remember that actually there are real people working in these facilities with real livelihoods. And so the government recently has obviously worked with Transport for London for an additional order for the Elizabeth line at Alstom in Derby, and I'm sure you will have seen the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State of Transport visiting Newton Aycliffe last week, welcoming an investment by First Group in an order for their open access. So we are working very closely with all the manufacturers, both in the short term and in the medium term, to try and have a smoother pipeline which will enable us to secure the future of these facilities, but also hopefully drive better value for the taxpayer, because the peaks and troughs are not necessarily conducive to getting the best prices.
As a Derby MP, the damage done by boom and bust is something that I'm very familiar with. I would like to ask how we can also ensure that when it comes to their supply chains, how we are really encouraging and enforcing that we use British talent and British jobs to be providing the work that they need when it comes to further down the supply chain.
Well, I'm bound to say some dull stuff about public procurement and dealing with procurement properly and legally. But yes, of course, the government wants to make sure that as much as possible is built or assembled in Britain. I'm very clear that the result of a long-term rolling stock strategy would be to give the market more confidence that things could be made here to be used here, and that's quite an important feature of it. I think the one other thing I'd say is that, of course, these plants, both the manufacturing and assembly plants, are primarily addressed at railway rolling stock. But the people who own them also ought to consider that this huge reservoir of really good skilled people can also be used for associated things. They're no longer people like Hitachi do a lot more than build trains, for example. And I gently reminded Hitachi at Newton Aycliffe that such a brilliant workforce who are so good at producing things could also produce other things for Hitachi if Hitachi chose to do that as well. Not instead, but as well.
I'm certainly biased considering Derby is a city that makes things in terms of the wide talents that there are there. But I was hoping to move on to ask about how the department is planning to address the skills crisis that we have in the rail sector.
So in terms of infrastructure and manufacturing, what we've talked about this morning in terms of having programmes, having clear programmes, a clear long-term capital programme, a clear strategy for rolling stock, those are the things which will enable the private sector supply industry to invest properly in skills and their workforce, and that's why we're determined to do that. However, that's not the only part of the railway that needs workforce planning, because the operating side of the railway is I mean, we didn't talk about it in detail, but if there's time we could, about the unprecedented really shortage of drivers that we've got, about the opportunities for a workforce that is largely looks like me, not quite as old as me, but is not half as diverse as it should be. There's some brilliant and large scale opportunities to renew the workforce in a more diverse way. And Alex could talk to you briefly at least about the work we're doing to find out really what that population looks like in detail across the country, the staff that are needed to replace either those who have gone or people who are going to retire. And that's a big job too. There are huge opportunities in the railway industry for skills, for lifetime employment and lifetime learning, and we are absolutely determined to face those head on for the benefit of people who want a decent career.
I'm certainly keen to understand more about operational skills, but if I could just come back to the manufacturing skills, because I think there's not a rail-related industry that I go to that doesn't talk about their real concerns about skills going forward. And you mentioned the private sector being able to plan for that, but will GBR not have a role when it comes to ensuring that we fill the skills gaps that we have?
Well, absolutely, and part of a point of a long-term railway strategy, part of the point of a capital review and a long-term capital programme, is to give those industries some assurance to be able to recruit and train people. Without it, they can't do it, and that's what they, I too listen to them very carefully. I'm quite frequently an attender at events from the Railway Industry Association, and they talk about nothing else because it's the future of their company, but it's also the future of their workforce and the people who could enter the supply chain if they knew that the orders were there for the future.
So from what you said, though, is the only role that GBR will have is providing that clarity as opposed to being more actively looking at the kind of skills that are needed and how we ensure that the training is in place for that?
I hope I didn't want to leave you with that impression. I don't see GBR as interfering with the railway supply chain into the future, because that is it's very successfully part of the private sector. But I do see GBR as giving real leadership to it and actually engaging with it in a practical and useful way forward. I don't think GBR should be supine in this. I think GBR, as the owner, the future operator and the divider of the strategy for the railway, ought to be intimately engaged with the supply chain to make sure all of that is maximised. And indeed, the point of maximising it is as I've done some things for the Railway Industry Association and others already, to actually make sure that we've got some exports out of it as well.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Alex?
So Euston Station, Minister, still a little bit of a mess. What's your latest assessment of the situation there?
So my latest assessment is, in fact, you will have seen in the press this morning pictures of the what was an advertising board, which is going to be turned back into an indicator board. I was there about 4 weeks ago to see what's being done to relieve congestion. The bookshop, which was on the right-hand side as you approach the platforms, is gone, as did Boots some time ago on the left-hand side to create more space. There are a number of other things, including Avanti making a much stronger attempt to board their trains earlier than they were previously advertised, and a different method of approach for London and North Western Railway, which is to put the passengers on the platforms even before the arrival of the trains. Those will all make a considerable difference to how the place works, and in fact I think I'm down there next week to see some of the results. Of course, I've been through it, and Avanti have started to load some of the trains early, and it does make a real difference, actually.
Okay, thank you. Ollie?
Yes, a key challenge within the industry has been timetable change management in recent years, and something that's been talked about for several years now is the East Coast Mainline timetable recast. It's sort of been on, off. How do you feel about the proposed timetable in its current form, and whether it gets the right balance between intercity, long distance and some of the more regional services?
Well, one of the reasons for wanting Great British Railways as a body to control the railway is that actually, whilst Network Rail was responsible for producing the timetable, it's quite clear that there was no real responsibility. There was no process by which you could establish what that timetable should be, and hence the difficulty about the East Coast Mainline timetable that we've talked about, and hence the fact that it's always been just about to be put into effect but hasn't got there so far. As I think Alex said earlier, that is with the Secretary of State and with me currently. We must do it. The question is whether we've got the best balance in an imperfect world about the competing demands of all the train services, including freight and open access, that need to use it. I'm optimistic that we can come to a conclusion very shortly for the benefit of all the users of the East Coast Main Line. The one thing I would say is that in a very congested railway there will inevitably be some people for whom the outcome is less than optimal. But one of the challenges that all railway operators have, however they're organised, is to make the best use of the infrastructure we can. And I'm very hopeful that in the near future we can say what we're going to do about the East Coast for the benefit of all the passengers who use it.
Do you feel that particular case highlights the need for more policy leadership from government overall as to what are the desired outcomes of the rail network, and what that balance should be between intercity, regional, commuter and freight?
I think it absolutely makes the case for GBR, because finding a process where nobody is apparently the decision maker and Network Rail are merely the people who execute a decision that has been so difficult to take is profoundly unsatisfactory.
Okay. We've got 2 or 3 wind-up questions, and then we'll go on to HS2 briefly. So, Lawrence, you had one on Access for All.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to follow up on the earlier discussion about an accessible railway The minutes of the May board meeting of Network Rail stated that the lack of traction on the Access for All programme, which had significantly underperformed in CP6, now created challenges in the transition to CP7. And earlier this week, the Minister for Local Transport stated that ministers are carefully considering the best approach to the Access for All programme. So my questions are, what went wrong in CP6? What issues are you grappling with for CP7? And when can we expect to see that fresh approach to accessibility upgrades?
So, two primarily different things in there. CP6 was the delivery of CP6's Access for All schemes was not, frankly, as good in Network Rail as it should have been in some of the Network Rail regions. And as I mentioned earlier, that's why Andrew has taken the programme back centrally and is giving some personal attention to rectifying that with a view to actually getting some delivery. And my understanding of delivery in the next calendar year is that there'll be a significantly more larger set of stations to be delivered in 2025 than would otherwise have been expected. The CP7 issues are part of the wider issues about determining how much we can afford and where they should be. We did discuss that a bit earlier. It's going to be quite a challenge to work out what actually are the schemes to take forward. You do need to do feasibility work. We did discuss that. Announcing a list of stations without understanding how feasible some of them are and how much they'll cost is really not much help, frankly. So we've got to work through that. And I fear it's going to take some months to get to an answer where we can actually say what's going to be delivered in CP7. As a real example, you can have an average cost of lifts and bridges, but some of the stations in that list of 50 published by the last government would take up significant amounts of budget just because of the configuration of the station.
Catherine, you had another. You wanted to just push on something.
No, I think my concern was I stopped you from telling us more about what you were doing when it came to operational skills and more workforce for future drivers. So we didn't get into that.
Let me turn to Alex, who can tell you both about how we're analysing the issue and what we intend to do about it.
So, I mean, the age profile for drivers is probably a bit higher than we would like. We expect many drivers to retire in the coming decade or so. And combined with that, at the moment, many operators are over-reliant on the use of overtime working for drivers. Some of that is a COVID legacy because it was difficult to continue with driver training during COVID, but obviously that was a number of years ago now. And one of the top priorities of this government is to improve performance on the railway. And when we sit down with Network Rail and the train operating companies, one of the key reasons for delays and cancellations is due to lack of available train crew. So we've asked every train operating company in their business plan to set out for the next 5 years how they're going to rectify their driver numbers in each of their operations. And we've commissioned someone to work on the department, on behalf of the department, to go into each train operating company and help assure that they have a plan to address this issue where in some parts of the country we don't have enough train drivers, and that is ongoing work. This will lead to lots of recruitment within the train operating companies. As the Minister said, this is an opportunity for us to attract a more diverse workforce to our industry, and so there's an incredible amount of work going on in that space with the primary aim of reducing the number of cancellations across the network, which is too high in large parts of the country.
Okay, thank you. I want to finish our questions on HS2, particularly to you, Minister, because I'll be guesting at Public Accounts Committee next Thursday morning, which is covering HS2, but you won't be there. It'll only be officials because of the way public accounts work. So let's ask you some questions now. So what are you doing to maximise the benefits of the delivery of just phase one? And does it, how can you ensure value for money if it doesn't proceed north of Birmingham?
Well, I think the very first thing to say is that this new government has to get this project, phase one of this project, under control. One of the best things that I've done since I took this role was last Monday when I went down to Old Common, not just because the government's going to fund the construction of tunnels to Euston, which was in the autumn statement, but also because it introduced Mark Wilde, who, as the new chief executive, I think that's a really positive decision, and I welcomed him. I know him because he's the guy who effectively brought Crossrail back from a very bad position and put it into service as the Elizabeth line. Now, I have to say, HS2 at phase one is a materially bigger job, so he'll need both himself and a team to do it. But we have to get that project back under. We've got to understand how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, and when it's going to open. To be in that position is profoundly unsatisfactory, but actually we have a lot of faith in Mark and the team that he'll assemble to do that. We also need more ministerial scrutiny of this than has occurred for some time. I was around long enough to have been at least party to the previous government's ministerial task force, but it sort of petered out about 4 years ago, and it doesn't seem to have been the subject in the last years of the last government of significant ministerial attention. And the Secretary of State and I are certainly going to give it ministerial attention because it's the largest construction project in the country. It's not satisfactory to have a project where we can't say with certainty how much it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, and that we have to rectify. We have to rectify it because we're not going to be very persuasive to the Treasury and to the Chancellor and to other parts of government about doing any more until we can at least show that we've got this properly under control, and we are absolutely determined to do that.
Okay, and Euston Terminus, what progress is being made towards establishing the Development Corporation, and are you confident that it will leverage in the private sector funding to help the capital costs?
So now that we know that the tunnels are going to Euston, it gives it puts rightly a spotlight on actually the development of the proposals for Euston itself. I chaired the Euston Partnership for 4 years in my previous role, so I can testify to the fact that certainly when it started there was no meeting of minds about the interaction between the station HS2 we're then going to build and the current Network Rail station. There was, in fact, for a long time, no money to replace the Network Rail concourse, but I'm pleased to say there is now. And I think that we are in the course, I hope, Alan, of producing a plan for Euston which will be comprehensive for passengers so that there will be one concourse for wherever you want to travel. We'll have a suitably sized HS2 station, and we'll also produce the scale of development on and around the station, which it deserves to have. It's adjacent to the life sciences part of London. It's going to be extraordinarily well connected. We're still in the course of deciding quite how all that works, and we do need a plan that's fundable. What else should we say, Alan, about that?
Well, I agree with all of that. The change in approach is really to focus on having to deliver 4 elements at Euston, which is the HS2 station, the redevelopment of the conventional station, getting the underground station to be able to be upgraded to deal with the capacity, but importantly the jobs and housing with the commercial opportunities associated with the site development. And our approach is to really recognise that all of those things work together. The historic problems has been each part has been looking at it too much on its own and not being willing to make those compromises. The work Lord Hendy did in his former role and that we're continuing now is to bring the parties together and to recognise the need to protect their own interests, particularly where there's operational railway issues for Network Rail and TfL, but to compromise in terms of the overall objectives. And towards that, we've made significant progress on an overall spatial plan that looks at how the oversight and adjacent site development and the 2 stations will work together with the underground. We've made good progress on getting a more cost-effective design for the HS2 station. we've made progress on development opportunities and the station concept for the Network Rail, including how we integrate the stations so that it feels like a good unified passenger service. And we still retain the preferred model, which is to work with a delivery company to have integrated design and integrated delivery to get the 3 stations and the oversight and adjacent site development away, but also to work with a development corporation which MHCLG is working on, and Beck Celia has been appointed to start work on the wider housing, so that the important benefits around the station in terms of housing and economic development and sensitive insertion of this transport infrastructure into Camden and into London is done in a joined up way. So there's work to do on how we assemble that model and operationalise it, but there's a good degree of consensus, I hope you agree, Lord Hendy. And in terms of funding, we see multiple sources coming together to make the overall endeavour work. So there's development receipts from the commercial development. There's a prospect of tax increment finance or equivalent from the development corporation, whether that's through a mayoral one or a Camden-led one. And then there's potential for private financing still of the HS2 station, and we're working that through with Treasury because it needs to work as a investable proposition as a station, but it also needs to work in kilter with wider Treasury rules on expenditure. I hope that's helped.
And I would just add that I saw yesterday the Global Chief Executive of Lendlease, who've been the development partner at Euston for some time. Lendlease have been through a journey of their own recently, but he confirmed to me that they are ready still to be able to develop on and around the station when we have a plan to do so. We have moved a long way. When I started at Euston Partnership, we were going to have 2 Platform 1s at Euston. We were going to have Platform 1 in the Network Rail station, and we were going to have Platform 1 in an HS2 station, which to all intents and purposes would have been regarded as completely separate from the... And of course it's nonsense, because people turn up there to go wherever they're going to go by train. They don't want that sort of organisation, and we've moved a long way from it.
Okay. Minister, what's your view of the proposal for Phase 2 from Hansacre towards Manchester and beyond that's coming from the Greater Manchester and West Midlands mayors?
So the previous Secretary of State and I met both mayors, and they described to us where they'd got to. Firstly, I would say without doubt, we have to fix the programme and the cost and the outcomes for Phase 1. Beyond that, there's a really major piece of work which Alan and his people are engaged with to work out the future of the railway, of the betterment of the railway in the Midlands and the north of England, of which clearly that forms part, but without doing a whole piece of work, both to work out when you've got Phase 1, how it might be used for the benefit of the nation, not just to Birmingham, but in connection with the rest of the railway network. And from that, there's this further piece of work about where new lines should be put, where they should be built, who should pay for them, and how they should be done.
How fast the operating speed needs to be?
Well, indeed. I risk straying into personal views, but actually the highest speed, high-speed railway in Britain is going to cost this nation a lot of money, and actually some of the aspects of the work done on the proposal between Birmingham and Manchester looks to us to be far more practicable. But I don't think we can consider it without A, fixing Phase 1, and B, doing a wider piece of work about how a new railway infrastructure contributes to the economy of the Midlands and the north of England. And that's the context in which we'll have to take it forward, I think, Alan.
Just a couple of
points. Can I just are we all accepting that there has to be additional capacity north of Birmingham?
Well, I think the answer to that is the industry's predictions, even post-COVID, show that there is a shortfall in capacity of the West Coast Main Line north of Hansacre in the next 10, 15, 20 years. But how we fix that, the way in which we fix it, and how it relates to the rest of the new railway infrastructure that everybody wants to see in the Midlands and the North, is something that we've got to work through to get, we've got to work through it as a whole and find a way of dealing with it. It's not right.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think Mayors Parker and Birmingham would be of the view that they view a potential capacity shortfall in the mid-2030s as a economic drag on growth, and we need to address that, and part of the government's job needs to do long-term capacity planning. Building new infrastructure isn't the only way to deliver new capacity, but sometimes it is necessary. There aren't spare paths on the West Coast Main Line, and trying to improve the West Coast Main Line will be enormously disruptive. At the same time, the government's been absolutely clear that we're not talking about reinstating phase 2. So as Lord Hendy describes, we need to look at what needs to be done by when. Can we achieve capacity improvements through smaller interventions, starting with rolling stock and how we use that, then moving on to small capacity increments, and then potentially contemplating bigger capacity improvements. But when we do put in new infrastructure, we have to do it better in a more controlled way, and we have to recognise it's part of a whole one rail system. And I think the power of doing it incrementally is to bring forward better passenger benefits sooner, but also have more control over the delivery. So there's a change in ethos and approach, but underneath it, we do need a long-term plan, because there is, under all reasonable modelling scenarios, going to be a capacity problem north of Birmingham.
And I should just finally say that when phase 2 was abandoned by the previous government, it's quite clear subsequently no thought whatever had been given to the prospect of what the train service on phase 1 would look like, because clearly it is connected with the rest of the railway network. The country deserves, having invested all this money, or investing this money, to have the best possible service provided using phase 1 in conjunction with the rest of the national railway network, and that's one of the jobs that needs to be done, and that will help us develop what the programme should be for future large-scale railway investment in the Midlands and the North.
Thank you, Minister. And for anyone else watching, tune in next Thursday morning, the 18th of December, for more on HS2. Sorry, Alan.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, for all the correct criticism of the delivery of phase 1, I do think we should just remember that there's 30,000 construction workers out there at the moment in dangerous conditions doing their best to deliver this for the country. So I think we should just note that, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to move from the network, which is desperately short of capacity, to one piece of the network that I've discovered is running massively under capacity, which is HS1, which the line is not going in with GBR, and you've got a single open access operator on the line at the moment. It has potential to get a lot of passengers and freight off the air and onto trains. Is there a plan for it?
Yes, indeed it does have potential. I think there are two things to say, one of which is, without giving away commercial confidence, is it looks to me as though we're nearer finding other passenger operators to use HS1 to access the continent now than we have been for some time. There are some issues involved in that, obviously, in particular capacity at the stations, and St Pancras, and also depot capacity, which have to be worked through. But I think that most people would think that it was very welcome to find people who wanted to use the HS1 for more capacity. There is, of course, also freight capacity available, and the department is undertaking further work to further reduce HS1 freight costs for international freight flows, and in particular there might be some good outcomes of the current ORR periodic review on HS1 which would help that, and I think the government will be very keen indeed to maximise its use for some very obvious reasons.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to you all for your contributions today. Thank you to the team and colleagues for the questions. If there's any further points you want to put to us in writing, we welcome that. I think we've all found the session very valuable. That concludes today's meeting. Order.